Hey guys, since there have been some comments from you guys asking about how to play against the Ruy Lopez, so for today's video, we're going to talk about how to counter the Ruy Lopez opening. So the Ruy Lopez starts off with the moves e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and bishop to b5. So here we're going to play the move pawn to a6, which is the main line, the more free defense, very common, and white usually retreats the bishop to a4, which is the common theory. Now, if instead of retreating the bishop back and white decides to capture our knight on c6, this is actually very good for us and not very good for white because we recapture back with the pawn, and it might seem that white can actually capture this our e5 pawn with the knight, and yes, he can capture the pawn, but after a simple move like queen to d4, our queen now attacks both the knight and the pawn at the same time. So white usually retreats his knight back to f3 to attack our queen. It's not a problem as we just capture the pawn with check. Now of course the white king can retreat to f1, moving it to the side, but that wouldn't make a lot of sense as the king would just be stuck in the center and not being able to castle, which is why white would probably play a move like queen to e2, also pinning our queen to our king. So here we're going to trade queens, and after king captures, king is moved, he can no longer castle, and if we take a look at this position, even though we have this double pawns on the c file, it's actually a very good position for black because number one, we have this amazing bishop pair. Remember, white already traded his light square bishop for our knight earlier on c6, so we have our bishop pair, and because the position is quite open due to our e and d pawns not being present, our bishop can develop freely, for example bishop to g4, bishop to c5, and our double bishops can put tremendous pressure on white's position. We can also castle queenside, for example, in just 2 moves after developing our bishop, and our rook will be able to control this file as well. So that's why usually white wouldn't want to play a move like bishop to c. Bishop captures knight over here, and if your opponent does play this move, there's nothing to be worried about, and probably your opponent doesn't know the actual Ruy Lopez theory. So anyways, let's get back to the video and let's see what happens after bishop to a4. So now I'm going to recommend you to play this move pawn to d6, and it's called the modern Stein's defense. So here white has 3 main options. He can play castle, he can play pawn to d4, or play pawn to c3, and we're going to take a look and explore all the 3 options. So firstly, let's take a look at what if white plays a move like pawn to d4. Now this is a very natural move for white to play because firstly, of course, white develops the d pawn to free up his bishop to come out later on, but more importantly, white is trying to utilize this pin on the knight over here to push up his d pawn, as maybe he wants to capture on e5 or even push up his pawn to d5 to try to win our knight on next move. But don't worry now because we just play pawn to b5 to kick away the bishop first, and this move, remember, was made possible because we played pawn to a6 early on, so now we can support this pawn to b5 push. So after pawn to b5, after white retreats the bishop, we can capture this d4 pawn with the knight over here. And after a series of trades, knight captures, pawn captures, queen captures, we're going to play this very aggressive move with pawn to c5. Now what's the idea of this pawn push then? The idea is very simple. We attack the queen, and also we gain a tempo after white moves his queen away to push up this pawn to c4 move, as we have created a cage for the white's bishop, and the white's bishop would be trapped on b3. So now let's see what can white do here. He can play queen to d5, which may look scary at first glance because he lines up the queen and the bishop along this diagonal to threaten to capture on f7, checkmate on the next move. The queen on d5 also attacks our rook on a8, so we just have to be careful. But don't worry because we can play this nice defensive move with bishop to e6. Our bishop blocks this diagonal from the queen reaching our pawn on f7. Our bishop also attacks the enemy's queen on d5, and by developing our bishop like this, our queen now actually guards this rook on a8, so white cannot capture our rook. Now if white retreats his queen anywhere back, we just play pawn to c4, and as I mentioned earlier, the bishop is already trapped. So white can use this check over here on c6, but don't worry because we just block with the bishop, and the queen doesn't really have many moves to go. Just either queen to d5 back or queen to b7. If let's say he goes queen to d5 back to again try to threaten checkmate in 1, that's not a problem now because we just push our pawn forward, pawn to c4, blocking away the bishop's diagonal, so there's no more queen takes f7 checkmate. Our rook is perfectly fine in the corner as it's protected by our queen, and we just win a piece easily in this variation. Alright, so let's go back to this position over here, and we've discussed what if white plays pawn to d4. So now let's see what about the second option with pawn to c3. This move is a very common move because it serves a few purposes. Number one, white can retreat his bishop later on to c2 if let's say we push up pawn to b5. A very common idea to retreat the bishop over here. We can support the e4 pawn, and also the pawn on c3 supports this center pawn push to d4. So now we're going to play a very kinda aggressive pawn push with pawn to f5, challenging white's center e-pawn. The most played option here, usually white plays, is to capture our pawn. We recapture back with the bishop, and again, the top option for white is to castle over here. So now, we're going to play this move bishop to d3 as we attack this rook on f1, but more importantly, we're trying to prevent white from pushing up his d-pawn, because by preventing white from developing the d-pawn, let's say to d3 or to d4, we are actually trapping this bishop on c1 already, and also we're kinda trapping the knight on b1 as well, because the knight cannot go to c3 because of the pawn, and by preventing the d-pawn from pushing forward, the knight cannot go to d2 as well, and the knight has only one square to develop, which is knight to a3, and that's not ideal for white usually in the Ruy Lopez. So by blocking the d-pawn, it prevents the development of the bishop, the knight, and the rook as well. So essentially, white's queen-side pieces are kinda stuck with this one simple move of bishop to d3. So white usually plays rook to e1, very simple, just move the rook out of the threat of the capture. And so let's see what do we have now in this position. So as black, it's very clear that we want to quickly develop our knight and our bishop, and also castle as quick as possible, and after castling, we might be able to use this f-file for our rook as well. So the very natural development moves are knight to f6 or bishop to e7. And now you guys have to be careful because we need to play this move bishop to e7 first. Why? Because if we play knight to f6, it's actually not a really good move for black, as white has this nice attacking idea with knight to d4. The whole idea being we cannot capture the knight with our pawn because our king is in pin. And also, this knight move now threatens to capture on c6 because after pawn takes, bishop takes, he gives check and attacks our rook at the same time. So we can defend this threat with a move like queen to d7 to protect the knight over here, but after knight captures, pawn captures, white has a move like queen to f3, attacking our bishop and putting pressure on our c6 pawn as well. So as you guys can see from the combinator evaluation over here, plus 1.3, plus 1.4 for white. So the position is slightly unpleasant for black, which is why in this position, be careful not to play knight to f6 first, but instead we play this developing move with bishop to e7 first, because now white no longer has this knight to d4 threat, because we can just simply capture the knight as our king is not in pin anymore, as our bishop blocks and protects our king. So after bishop to e7, since our bishop on d3 is very annoying as we prevent white from developing his pieces, white will usually play a move like bishop to c2 and try to trade away the light square bishops. So after we trade away the bishops, bishop capture, queen capture, we stick back to our plan of developing our pieces and trying to castle as soon as possible. Now, another natural move for white to make is pawn to d4, because firstly, it frees up the bishop to develop, frees up the knight as well, and also white actually wants us to capture on d4 so that he can activate this e-file for his rook, which is why we don't want to capture this pawn to allow white to have full control of the e-file, and we play pawn to e4, pushing out our pawn instead, try to block the e-file, and also we attack the knight on f3. Now, white can play this move knight to g5 to attack our pawn instead. That's not a problem because we just push up our d-pawn. And now you might be wondering, what if white plays a move like knight to e6 over here? Because the knight actually attacks our queen and attacks our pawn at the same time, and there's no way to defend both pieces at the same time. But actually, we want to invite white to play this knight to e6 move because we are going to prepare a trap for this knight. So now we just move our queen out of danger, queen to d7, and after knight takes g7 check, we are going to play this move king to f7, and as you guys can see, the knight on g7, the white's knight on g7 is almost trapped ready. It can't go to h5 because of our knight, can't go to f5 or e6 because of our queen, obviously. So the only way for white to protect this knight is to play bishop to h6, protecting the knight, and now we finish off our trap with this move with bishop to f8, and we win a piece on the next move already, as there's no way for white to defend the knight. There's no way for white to bring in an extra piece to defend this knight. If white plays a move like knight to f5, it's not a problem, we just capture it with the queen, and as black we are comfortably one piece up. Okay, so let's go back to this position, and lastly we need to discuss what if white plays castle, which is also the top move in this position, or the most played move. So after castle, we're going to play this move bishop to g4, and our idea is very simple. Not only we develop our bishop, we are giving this annoying pin on the knight to the queen, and we also have threats like, for example, we want to play pawn to b5 on the next move, kicking away the bishop, so that it frees up our knight to go to d4 and we further attack this knight on f3. So if white doesn't do anything about it, it can translate into annoying threat or annoying attack for us. So, which is why usually white plays pawn to h3, try to kick away our bishop from this diagonal, and white expects that we're going to retreat the bishop here to h5, but that's not the case because we're going to play super aggressively with this move, pawn to h5, sacrificing our bishop on g4. The whole point being is, white can never capture our bishop on g4 because after captures, we just recapture back with the pawn, and all of a sudden, this allows us to activate our h-file for the rook. Our pawn attacks the knight on f3, and it doesn't really matter where the knight retreats, to either e1 or to h2. For example, let's say if it goes to h2, because now we have this nice move with queen to h4, doubling up along the h-file, and we actually threaten to give checkmate in the next few moves already. Also, if white plays a move like pawn to f3, trying to bring out his king to escape this way, we just push up our pawn to g3 to block this escaping square from the king, and we can give checkmate on h2 or on h1. So that's why white cannot capture our bishop on g4 due to this very dangerous attack along the h-file. So white usually plays pawn to c3. Now, again, the same idea we seen earlier in the previous position. He can drop his bishop back, and also he's preparing to push up this pawn to d4. Very common idea in the Ruy Lopez. So now we're going to play this move queen to f6. We are putting further pressure on this knight on f3, and also our queen on f6 actually guards this square on d4 to prevent white from pushing up his pawn. So now white has two main options in this position. He can play pawn to d3, or he can choose to play pawn to d4 as well. Now remember, I just said queen to f6 guard this square as well. So let's see why can't white play this move pawn to d4. Because after pawn to d4, we're going to push up this pawn to b5, attacking the bishop first. Let's say the bishop retreat over here. Now we're going to capture this knight, as the knight was defending this pawn on d4, right? So we just remove the defender, and it doesn't really matter if he takes back with the knight, with the pawn or the queen. If he takes back with the pawn, we just capture here on d4 to gain the pawn, because after captures, we take back with the knight. Our queen protects the knight now, and the white's queen cannot capture our knight, and we have further threats on with our knight to capture more pieces in the future. Similarly, if he captures back with the queen over here, so queen takes, we're just going to trade queens, and after pawn takes, again, we're going to take back this pawn. If pawn captures, knight captures, with similar threats on f3, b3, or even knight to e2 check. Now, if white plays this sneaky move with bishop to d5, it looks dangerous from first glance because it threatens to capture our knight and our rook at the same time, but don't worry because we have this nice defensive resource with knight g to e7. our knight not only protects our other knight on c6, but our knight also attacks this bishop on d5. If white captures back our pawn now, we just take the bishop first. Be careful, don't take this pawn first because our rook is hanging, right? So be careful, we capture the bishop first, and after pawn takes, we take back with similar threats with our knight, and we also gain a pawn. So that's why this queen to f6 is such a powerful move, as we threaten to capture, we put pressure on the knight on f3, and also our queen controls this d4 square, which is why white cannot play this move pawn to d4. So if white can't play this move pawn to d4, he would have to play pawn to d3 then, because he has to develop this bishop somehow. For example, bishop e3, bishop g5 maybe, and also develop the knight to d2. So now we're going to play this move knight to e7. And the idea is very simple here. We just develop our knight. Our knight also protects this knight on c6. And another important thing to note is that white can never capture our bishop on g4. Remember, white can never do it because after we capture, if the knight moves, we always have queen to h4 anytime and attacking along this h-file. And also if white tries to play a move like bishop to g5, trying to develop his bishop, attacking our queen, it's actually a blunder because we can gain a piece already. So we just capture this knight first, our bishop attacks the queen, and because the knight is no longer on f3, it no longer protects the bishop on g5, so we are also threatening to capture the bishop at the same time. If white captures back with either the g-pawn or with the queen on f3, we just take back this bishop and we gain a piece. So white has to capture our queen, we just capture his queen, and again, if he takes the bishop with either the rook or the bishop, we just capture back this bishop on f6 and we gain a piece. So white has to capture here on e7, and now we just take another piece on a4, and as you guys can see, we are easily up a piece already. So therefore, the top move for white here is to play knight b to d2, and this move develops a knight. It also offers extra protection on the f3 knight, and maybe later on, white can play a move like rook to e1, knight to f1, followed by knight to g3, also a very common maneuver in the Ruy Lopez. So now we're going to play this very aggressive move with pawn to g5, pushing up both our g and h pawns to launch future kingside attack on the white's king. So again, the top move for white is rook to e1, and now we're going to retreat this bishop here to d7. But before that, just to illustrate, again, white cannot capture our bishop on g4 because after pawn takes. Now, even though we push up our g-pawn, so this kind of blocks our queen on h4, we actually have another move with queen to h6, which essentially does the same thing to line up along the h-file to give checkmate. Because, for example, if the knight moves somewhere, let's say to h2 or to e1, again, it doesn't really matter, we have queen to h6 and it's threatening checkmate, just like all the previous moves before. Which is why white can never capture, as I mentioned earlier on, white can never capture our bishop on g4. So here after white plays rook to e1, we're going to retreat the bishop now to d7. Our bishop on d7, the idea of this bishop on d7 is not to protect this c6 knight or not to get rid of this pin on the bishop, but more importantly, we free up this g4 square which was previously occupied by our bishop. We free up this square because now we want to push our pawn forward with pawn to g4 on the next move. And pawn to g4 is really a very dangerous attack because our pawn on g4 will attack this pawn on h3, attacks the knight on f3 as well. And if white captures back on g4, we just recapture back, and again that will allow us to open up the h-file. Which is why white can play a move like pawn to h2, a preemptive move to protect against this g4 square. But that's not a problem because we play the move pawn to g4 anyways. And as I mentioned, we attack this pawn on h3. If white doesn't do anything about it, we just capture. On h3, if pawn recaptures, we can play rook to g8 and obtain this g-file. And if white captures over here, we just recapture and we obtain this h-file. So regardless, it's already a very good position for black. So now let's see what if white plays a move like knight d to f1. So the knight further protects this knight on h2, and white is bringing a piece closer to the king to try and defend the king. But that's not a problem because we just castle, and I'm going to show you how do we attack white's king in a moment. So now white can actually capture this g4 pawn because after knight takes g4, if we play a move like queen to h4, because the knight is ready on f1, he can just retreat the knight this way, and we no longer have checkmate because the knight defends. But that's not a problem because we actually want white to capture on g4, as now not only we have the h-file, later on when we develop the bishop and the rook, we can move the rook over here to control the g-file as well. So here we just move a queen sideways, let's say to g6. Our queen and our bishop attacks the knight, so he has to move back the knight somewhere. Let's say he goes back to h2, and now we just play this move bishop to h6, trading away our dark square bishop because, as I mentioned, we want to bring this rook on the g-file and we line up our attack over here. Now in some cases, let's say if white trades the bishop, we can either capture back with the queen or the rook, because let's say we take back with the rook, and we can also now triple up along the h-file. For example, we are going to play rook to h8, queen to h7, and all of a sudden we have 3 pieces along the h-file, which is very, very dangerous for white. And also, if let's say bishop takes, we can also take back with the queen because that frees up the g6 square for our knight. We can jump our knight to g6, to f4 or to h4, followed by rook here to give potential threats in the future. So these are some of the attacking ideas from black. We just develop our rook on the g-file. We can either double up or triple up along the h-file or the g-file to create these attacking threats on the white's king. And if, as you guys can see, the chess.com stockfish actually evaluates this as minus 1.68 for black, even though we are currently down a pawn. But if you run this position on a stronger engine and on a higher depth, the stronger engine actually gives black with a significant advantage with minus 2.5. So it's a very easy attacking position for black to play. Alright, so that's all for today's video. Congratulations on mastering how to counter the Ruy Lopez. If you're interested in learning how to play the Scotch Gambit, then click on this video. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.